Great. So hello, everyone. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are very happy to welcome you for another NOBEC talk. We will follow an agenda that is the same as in previous occasions. There will be a short welcome that I always do. Then we will have a pre-recorded video of our NOBEC early career researcher for this week, which is Shang from the MIT Sloan School of Management. And then we will have the main talk with Dr. Dan Romer from the Annenberg Public Policy Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. And at the end, 15 minutes for Q&A. A brief reminder, as I always do, that the NOBEC Talks speaker series is organized by our Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center that works with organizations all over the world, all types of organizations, to sustainably enact positive behavioral change. We do mostly consulting, research, and training services. If you're interested in what we do and our research and the things we offer, please visit our website. It's there on the screen. And if you'd like to know more about our news and opportunities, please scan this QR code and you will be directed to our Twitter page. As probably most of you know, we recently announced our Spring-Summer 2022 programming. These are the talks that have been scheduled for now, with one that will be hopefully scheduled soon for the summer. You can always visit our website, nobectalks.com, to get the updated information on all the talks, the titles and the abstracts of a lot of them, as we are always updating the details, and also the videos of all of our previous talks. You can also scan the QR code as well. And as I did last time, we are very happy to let you know that the NOBEC conference in person at the University of Pennsylvania is back. This is a yearly conference that we used to do before the pandemic. Then with the pandemic, we pivoted to these bi-weekly NOBEC talks online. And now the NOBEC conference is back again. Last time I announced Professor Leonardo Bushtin from the University of Chicago as one of the keynote speakers. Today, I'm happy to announce Professor Michelle Gelfand from Stanford as the other keynote speaker. The conference will be on the 13th and 14th October, so please save the date. And we will have a call for papers and posters that will go out towards the end of this month. If you'd like to get updates about the conference, please follow this link. I will paste it in the chat in a moment, or follow the QR code. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you're joining us, please remember to mute yourself if you're not already muted. If possible, if you want, please keep your camera on so that we have a more interactive experience. For questions, you can either use the chat during the talk or the raise hand function at the end during the Q&A slot. And we are transmitting on Facebook Live right now, and the recordings of the sessions will be uploaded to our website. Great. With that, let me introduce our NOBEC early career researcher for this week. Shang is a PhD candidate at the MIT Sloan School of Management. We are going to change a little bit how we do this this time. So Jerry is in the audience. Could you please very shortly introduce yourself, Jerry?
Hi, thank you, Paulius. I'm Jerry. I'm a fifth-year PhD at MIT Sloan School of Management, and I'm in the marketing program. And I mainly work with Professor Jochen Prilik and Professor Dave Rand. And my thesis is about how do people update their beliefs and what we can learn from people's belief updating. And this is one of the projects that I've been working on with Professor Dave Rand.
Perfect, great. Thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us and for your introduction. If you want, you can put your website link in the chat so that people can check, and also your paper link if you want. And with that, let me change my screen to the video. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jerry, a fifth-year PhD from MIT Sloan. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce my recent working paper in collaboration with Professor Dave Rand. The paper's title is Sincere or Motivated Partisan Bias in Non-Political Information Processing. Our project has two main goals. First, we empirically establish that partisan bias exists even when subjects are completing non-political tasks. For example, subjects are first asked to judge whether a non-political headline is accurate on a 7-point scale. They are then given the rating from an advisor before they are allowed to update their initial rating. We find that Democrats revise their initial rating more if the same piece of accurate advice is framed as coming from their co-partisan than from their counter-partisan. But Republicans do not exhibit such biased advice taking based on advisors' partisanship. Next, which is the highlight of our paper, we propose an experimental design to disambiguate two distinct mechanisms, namely, is the biased advice taking driven by a preference-based account or a belief-based account? The preference-based account refers to that people are less swayed by a counterpartisan advice, not because they think the counterpartisan advice is inaccurate, but because they feel uncomfortable to side with their counterpartisan. In this case, the advice taking is based on some preference motivation, but not accuracy. On the other hand, the belief-based account refers to that people are less swayed by counterpartisan advice because they sincerely believe that a counterpartisan is less competent. Although in our context, such a belief is incorrect because Republicans and Democrats are equally good at evaluating those non-political headlines. So how do we disentangle these two accounts? The key element of our identification is that in an incentivized task, there exists a trade-off between a preference-based account and a belief-based account. First, updating according to one's sincere belief of the advisor's competence is optimal for accuracy. If subjects really believe the device is accurate, they should update more, otherwise they update less. Ex-ante, that would give subjects the most monetary bonus. If the preference-based account exists, even though people know that taking more advice from a counterpartisan will make themselves more accurate and earn a higher bonus, they may refuse to do so to avoid bad feelings from siding with a counterpartisan. Therefore, our treatment is to raise the monetary incentive on an accurate updated answer by 1,000-fold. This treatment should make the accuracy motivation dominant and reduce the relative impact of the preference-based account when subjects are taking advice from a counterpartisan. In other words, if a preference-based account exists, a higher monetary incentive should reduce the partisan bias. The rationale is that subjects are now likely to endure their distaste of a counterpartisan for the sake of significant money gained from an accurate advice taking. But here are the results. The x-axis is whether subjects receive a 1-cent low incentive or a $10 high incentive on their updated answer. The y-axis is subjects' amount of update given the advice. The color corresponds to whether the provided advice is from a subject's co- or counterpartisan, who hereby presents results on 1,600 Democrats and 1,600 Republicans separately. First, as we can see, Democrats update their initial judgment more if the same piece of accurate advice is from their co-partisan. This is evidence of partisan bias. But as we raise the incentive, although more advice is taken than in a low incentive condition, this is equally true for co- and counter-partisans. So incentive does not reduce partisan bias among Democrats. This pattern may be interpreted as, for instance, subjects are exerting more effort in the tasks facing a higher incentive, which results in more advice taking. If preference-based account exists, we should see a larger increase in update given counter-partisan advice compared to co-partisan advice. Since that does not happen in our data, we do not have evidence that a preference-based account is the main driver of biased advice taking among Democrats in our context. As for Republicans, we do not observe biased advice taking. Similarly, although incentive increases advice taking, there is no evidence of preference-based reasoning. To further examine the belief-based account, we find that Democrats really believe their co-partisans are more competent, but such incorrect belief is much weaker among Republicans. Furthermore, the beliefs are sincere, as a 1,000-fold increase in incentive during this belief elicitation does not affect subjects' stated beliefs or of the relative partisan competence. So there is no evidence of preference-based account in stating beliefs or partisan-motivated beliefs in our context. These results support the claim that the biased advice taking in the main task is driven by beliefs, not preference. Finally, we find that providing a feedback that suggests counter-partisans who are potentially more competent are able to correct subjects' beliefs. This also does not support the preference-based account because instead of ignoring the feedback and feel good about their own party, subjects are willing to substantially change their opinions about their counter-partisans. The implication of our study is that the current political divide in American society maybe is not because Republicans and Democrats want to hate each other, but due to their incorrect beliefs about each other. For example, when people are in echo chamber, they always hear bad things about their counterparty, which contribute to their incorrect beliefs. But if people are exposed to positive news about their counterpartisans, people are willing to correct their beliefs. So maybe that's what we should do. Thank you. Here's my contact info. If you have any questions, please let me or Dave know. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you so much, Jerry, for joining us and for the great presentation. As in previous occasions, unfortunately, we don't have time for live questions now, but Jerry is here, so please feel free to ask any questions or share any comments in the chat. And with that, here. Yeah, and with that, I can introduce our main speaker for today. Dr. Dan Romer is the research director at the Annenberg Public Policy Center here at the University of Pennsylvania. He has conducted research at the Annenberg School for Communication since 1990, focusing on media and social influences on adolescent health, with particular attention to the social transmission of risky behavior. And among other themes, he has served on numerous grant review panels from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and is in the editorial board of several journals, including PLOS ONE, the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, Cyber Psychology, Behavior and Social Networking, and the Journal of Broadcasting and Electronic Media. The presentation for today is called Conspiracy Beliefs and Resistance to Collective Action, and I will be the moderator in today's session. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Romer, and please feel free to share your screen.
Is that working?
Not yet.
Ah. Okay.
Yeah, now it is.
All right. Are we on?
Yes.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Paulius. And I'm sorry to say that Christina is not, she sent me a note a little while ago that she's not able to join today. And I wanted to thank her for actually inviting me, and I can't do that in person. So in absentia, I'm thanking her for inviting me to give this presentation today. So what I'm going to do is, here's my outline. Let me move it over a little bit. I'm going to talk about the nature and characteristics of conspiracy theories and the belief systems that are prone to accept them. The methods we've used for studying their prevalence and influence during the pandemic year 2020. And I'm going to focus a lot on the media outlets that attracted and supported people who believed in these conspiracies. And it actually intersects nicely with the talk we just heard, because the talk we just heard, sort of proposed the idea that there are echo chambers that people get trapped in willingly, of course, but which tend to maintain and support beliefs that they have. And so I'm going to end with how this poses challenges for how to deal with the pandemic and other crises of governance that we face here in the US. So for those of you who don't know, the way conspiracy theories are typically defined is that they're explanations for major events with unknown actors who have great power and they have malevolent intent who are responsible for those events. So some prominent examples are things like JFK's assassination was actually planned by the CIA, or the 9/11 attacks were actually carried out and planned by the US government. And then one that's probably relevant to the pandemic is the measles vaccine is harmful to children, and the government and the pharmaceutical industries covering this up. So in each of these cases, you've got powerful figures who can control the world and produce malevolent outcomes. So what we're going to talk about today is what's called a conspiracy mindset or mentality, which is a little different from the way we define a conspiracy theory, because it involves people's underlying belief systems that question the credibility of knowledge-generating institutions, such as mainstream media, science, and academia. And these mindsets are predisposing people to accept conspiracies because they're skeptical of governments and the powerful actors, including charitable organizations in the private sector, as well as companies. So in the, in the private sector, when we think of charitable organizations, someone like Bill Gates comes to mind. There are all kinds of conspiracies about him. And of course, companies, you've got the pharmaceutical industry. So what we did in our work is we focused on the intersection between government and science. So these are agencies within the US government that actually represent both the power of the US government and the role of science in helping us to cope with the pandemic via ways to behave, medical advances, and protections that are given to those who are affected by the pandemic. So, as you know, talking about, when you have a pandemic, one of the big issues is, well, who are you going to trust about what to do? And I'm trying to move, I guess I can't move this over. Sorry about the cutoff there. So ideally, what one would want in a pandemic, a major crisis like a pandemic, is to be able to trust the government and the science it uses to motivate compliance. And so we looked at these agencies that are within the government that use science to make recommendations. So the most important, of course, is CDC, but there's NIH and FDA. All of these are agents of the government. And we would want people to trust them, in part because they are science-based and in part because we believe the government is there to represent our interests. Now, people with conspiratorial mentality are going to be prone to distrust both science and the government. And so here are three that we looked at during the first year of the pandemic. And these are very common, and I'll show you, I'll give you the evidence for that. First of these was that the virus was caused by the Chinese government, which it's not easy to say whether it's true or not. The point is it's questioning what we should do about it, because it's focusing our attention on China. It's potentially causing rifts within our country. We might start distrusting people of Chinese background. It's actually taking our focus away from what we should be doing, which is changing our behavior to control the pandemic. Another one that we looked at is one that was also promoted, I guess it's no secret to say, by the president, that CDC was actually motivated to exaggerate the virus and its effects because it was damaging him. And then the third was also common and probably was present prior to the pandemic. Okay, that the vaccines and the various medical interventions are benefiting pharma. So here's what we did. We had a national probability sample that we were able to create in the March of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were very fortunate in that. And this is both me and Kathleen Jamison, who's the director of the Policy Center. So we had a first wave in March, we had the same people again in July, and then a third wave in November. So we were able to watch these people over the course of the first year of the pandemic. We also have an ongoing election study, which the results of which will be coming out the end of the year, where we looked at 4 battleground states, and we had over 8,000 respondents there. And that study was led by a whole bunch of folks affiliated with the Policy Center. And we covered a whole range of topics about conspiracy beliefs, the mentality that we think underlies these, trust in health authorities, willingness to vaccinate, would people wear masks or not, what is their knowledge about vaccination, what kind of fears do they have, and then a very central part of the story I'm going to tell is what kind of media did they use during the pandemic, and what are their backgrounds demographically, politically, and religious-wise. So here's the argument that I'm going to put forth. We're going to argue that a significant segment of the US population, as well as other countries, holds a conspiratorial mindset about the workings of the government, science, health authorities, and mainstream media. It's susceptible to leaders who use conspiratorial appeals for various political and other benefits. The media that support those leaders provide news and opinion that is consistent with conspiracies, resulting in an echo chamber. I think this is the most controversial part of our argument because, as I'll mention in a moment, there are a lot of people who don't think echo chambers are very powerful, that they don't have much impact, especially in the US. And then what I'm going to argue is that all of this serves to undermine collective action due to the erosion of trust in the institutions that serve to guide action in a response to an emergency like the pandemic. So when we look at conspiratorial thinking tendencies, we have different ways of measuring it. So one way is to ask people about beliefs they have that are relevant to a mindset. And these are 3 items that were used quite commonly by a political scientist and his group. And as you can see, these are items that if you agree with these, and people tend to agree with one of these will agree with the other, have a mindset that says, there are a lot of unknown actors in the world, and that they are willing to do things in private that are not to the benefit of the ordinary person. And when we first looked at this, we got a distribution that looks like this. to the right is are people who agree, and to the left are people who disagree. And I think it's fair to say that if we use a distance of 1 standard deviation, these are standardized scores. If we use a metric of 1 standard deviation away from the average, we're talking about 20% of a representative sample of the US population agreeing with these items. There's another way to measure it. You can ask people about conspiracies that have been bandied about over time. And so we did this in another survey. And these are items, again, that, if you believe these, you think there are secret agents in the world trying to do things that are harmful to the average American. And people who agree with one of these will tend to agree with the other. And here's the distribution of this score. And on the right is the people who disagree. So that's a large number out of this sample. But again, if you go to the more than 1 standard deviation away from the average, this bunch of folks here, you're again talking about 20% and this is again a representative US sample. You can also look at this cross-culturally. There was a survey done in, I think, 8 different countries, and the blue bars represent the proportion of people in those surveys who did not believe any of 7 or 8 different conspiracy type items. And so you can see this, countries differ. Hungary at this end, a lot of people believe in various conspiracies. But then as you go across the list here, when you get to Sweden, you've got almost 50% not believing in any one of them. And the US is actually not so bad off if you take this as a metric. On the other hand, if you look at the proportion of people who believe in only one of these, just as one kind of baseline, you see that almost all of them have over 20% who will believe in one of these, and the US is certainly in that boat. And Sweden is the only one that actually has a low number here. And this is somewhat misleading because even within the US, there's a lot of people who will believe one of these. So, and I think that's actually higher than some of these other countries. But in any case, these are not uncommon kinds of beliefs. Christina, early in the pandemic, did her own study across lots of countries. And she asked people, who do you trust? Do you trust science or do you trust the government? In things like, would you socially distance? And she looked at people who had high trust in both science and the government for things like social distancing and staying at home. And she found that it was science that was more important than trust in the government. And of course, if you have neither, you're very low willingness to do either of them. So her conclusion was that science is really important. If you want to get people to do things that are beneficial for a collective action, you've got to get people to believe in science. Well, there was another study that was done again. I think this is in 8 countries, a little later in the pandemic, starting in September. And these investigators looked at various correlates of willingness to accept a vaccine. And as you can see at the very top here, trust in national health authorities is almost as strong at the bivariate level as trust in scientists. So I think that, and this is, I'm showing you this because this is what we looked at basically, is trust in national health authorities in the US. And I'm just making the point that that's very similar to what people say when it comes to science. And as Christina found, trust in government is a little less. And conspiracy beliefs are the most negative. So people who believe in conspiracies, have a conspiratorial mentality, are least likely. And that holds up even when you when you put these all into the same model. Another thing to point out is, prior to the pandemic, there's research that was done looking at conspiracy mentality in all of these different countries. And around the world, people with a conspiracy mentality were skeptical about vaccines. And this was something that was noted. The World Health Organization said that anti-vaccination attitudes and behaviors were a international crisis in 2019, even before the pandemic. So this was already something that was established among people with this mentality. They did not trust governments and science to promote vaccination within their own countries. And you can see the US is above average on this score. So we've already got a predisposition not to accept vaccination for COVID, not only in the US, but all over the world. So let me take you now through what we've learned when we did our own research in the US, because I'm going to try to unpack why this might be happening. So again, we have these three conspiracies that we used, and they are people who believe in who report thinking that one of these is true will also say the other is true, which a lot of people have pointed out makes no sense. But what makes sense is that underlying them is a conspiratorial mentality. And what you see is going from March to July to November, there wasn't much change in the pharma conspiracy. It basically was, between 10 and 20% and not much change. The other two definitely increased, so that the CDC concern and even more widespread that China created the virus. And when we look at the relationship between belief in these conspiracies and whether or not people were willing to get vaccinated, even as early as March, right at the beginning. And one thing to remember is Trump in March said, I'm going to have this warp speed program. We're going to have a vaccine by the end of the year. But people who were willing, or, who already had doubts about the pandemic were far more likely to say that they were not going to take this vaccine. One of the things that I want to point out is that belief in these or having a conspiratorial mentality is potentially rooted in a certain amount of realism. So when we look at non-white respondents in our survey, you can see that this particular conspiracy about the pharmaceutical industry is quite prevalent relative to those people who are not Hispanic, for example, are much more likely to believe that than people who are not Hispanic. And the same thing is true for African Americans. They're much more likely to think that the industry is got something, the industry does not have its interests at heart. And you see this in when you ask people of Hispanic backgrounds whether they would trust someone like Fauci. And this, again, is early on. Compared to people who are not Hispanic, their trust in Fauci was much lower, or they were not familiar with him, but there was no difference there. And the same goes for Black Americans. Not a lot of trust compared to other folks in someone like Fauci. And I think this is based in a certain amount of realism. They've had bad experiences with the health system. They're not sure. And there's lots of evidence that both of these groups will accept a vaccine to a lower degree than others. And so I think there's a certain amount of realism that is attached to their mentality. So when we looked at, let's see what our data showed in relation to what people were willing to do. Again, this is early in the pandemic, March, just at the point where we're starting to do things. And so we asked people, have you done any of these things? And, you got a lot of people saying they've done these things. And if you look at the number of things they've done, almost 40% said they did all 7 of these. So, we got quite a bit of cooperation here. But if you look at the relationship between a number of things done and whether or not people believed in the composite of these conspiracies, you see much, quite a bit less willingness to do those things. Now we look at some of what we quickly realized were important predictors of conspiracy beliefs regarding the pandemic. If you look among political conservatives, these are people who self-identify as political conservatives. The agreement with both the deep state and the Chinese weapon conspiracy is much higher, is quite high. Not so much for the pharma argument. And among liberals, much less, okay? I mean, this is really highly related to political orientation. And again, no surprise because, and I don't have to remind you that Trump was promoting both of these, much less on pharma, but he was definitely promoting, he and his administration were promoting these two particular conspiracies throughout that year. So we wanted to look at some of the factors that also might be related to taking preventive action and seeing, well, do they override or are they relevant to whether or not conspiracies will predict what people will do in terms of things like wearing a mask or taking a vaccine. So threat of the disease has certainly got to be a factor. So we asked people, how worried are you about getting infected? How much of a threat is the pandemic to the country? These should motivate behavior. On the other hand, for mask wearing, for vaccines in particular, beliefs about the dangers of vaccine are going to probably inhibit interest in taking a vaccine, especially when we don't know much about it. And early in the pandemic, we really didn't know what kind of vaccination strategies we were going to get and whether they would work or not. So this is a structural equation model that we used. If I can, oops, I'm trying to make it. Okay, I guess you can see it. So we looked at change over time from March to July in action to the actions that people were recommended to take, a composite in March, and then we looked at whether they would be willing to wear a mask in July, because in March, mask wearing wasn't recommended, but in July it was. And as you can see, people are willing to take actions in March were much more, not quite a bit more willing. These are standardized to wear a mask in July. Okay, so then here's the tendency to believe in these conspiracies. For taking action in March, being threatened by the disease and thinking it's a national threat, all of these are negatively related to having conspiracy beliefs. And of course, if your conspiracy beliefs inhibit these things, they're certainly going to inhibit action. And they do that directly as well as through these perceptions of threat. And then when you go towards mask wearing in July, apart from the carryover, people who believed in the national threat, again, who were less likely to do that, were also more likely to wear a mask. But on top of that, people with conspiracy beliefs were less likely to wear a mask. And you see a strong effect of ideology. So liberals were more likely to think there was a threat, both personally and nationally, and more willing to take action. And this predicted increased mask wearing. And the other thing you notice is people who are watching mainstream TV, which a lot of people are doing, are more likely to see a threat and to take action over and beyond what they were doing in March. And when we look at vaccination, we see, again, conspiracy beliefs negatively related to threat, positively related to the fear of a vaccine, not the one that we're thinking about, which is the COVID vaccine, but of another vaccine. It's much more likely to think vaccines are harmful. Again, this goes back to what I was showing you before, that people with these beliefs were already set to think that vaccines are not a good thing. And of course, that predicted less willingness, even controlling for how much they were willing to do it in March, less willingness to take a vaccine in July. And even over and beyond that, much less willing. These are standardized scores, so somewhat more less willing. And again, mainstream TV, more likely to think this is a national threat. People are home watching TV, not a surprise, and also more likely to vaccinate, willing to vaccinate. So what these results raise to us is, well, what influences either persistence or change in these beliefs, these conspiracy beliefs? Do uses of various media play a role in either the persistence or growth in conspiracy beliefs? And I showed you earlier, there was growth, especially in the two that Trump promoted. And then are some people more prone to these beliefs than others? So we had a probe of various kinds of media use. I'm sorry, I'm cutting you off here. But we asked people, what do you use? What do you rely on for information? Just information in general. And at the top of the list here, I'm showing it, which is going to be important, is people who are watching Fox. And at the time, Rush Limbaugh was still alive. But these are all media that are associated with conservative political views. You've got mainstream TV, you've got the liberal media, those many of you may be watching or reading this. You've got the aggregators who don't have any particular point of view, but just aggregate news. You've got social media, and you've got print, mainstream print, which includes these, but there are others, but these are the big national ones. And when you look at what people are using, of course, mainstream, and I'm sorry, I'm cutting off here. I can't seem to, I'm cutting this off. But anyway, this is over 40%. Mainstream is really big, but conservative, this is 20%. Conservative is quite high, certainly higher than liberal, and comparable in size to other very important sources of information like mainstream print. So among people who use conservative media, if you look at what happened between March and July, you see this big increase in the two that were particularly relevant to Trump and his base. There's some increase in pharma, but first of all, much more belief in these two and a bigger increase. If you look at mainstream TV, not much going on with these, and somewhat of an increase in the Chinese weapon argument, which I think had a certain amount of plausibility. You couldn't discount it, certainly, and we're still arguing about it. Social media, also quite a bit of belief, but not as much. You don't see as big a jump as you saw for conservative. And mainstream print, if anything, for two of these, you're seeing a decline from March to July, and only a slight increase in the Chinese weapon argument. So what we did, the prior analysis I showed you just looked at conspiracy beliefs in March and said, well, do they predict how people are going to behave in July? Here we looked at what predicts change in conspiracy beliefs. And so going from March to July, quite a bit of consistency. One thing you notice, here's some of the individual differences that are related to these beliefs in March. So whites are less likely to believe in them. And as I showed you earlier, non-whites do have a tendency to believe in these somewhat more. And younger people as well. And people who watch mainstream television were also less likely. But none of these were related to change. What was related to change was more educated people believed them less. Conservative media believed them more, over and above how they believed in them to begin with. Mainstream print believed in them less to begin with and believed in them less over time. Social media, not a huge relationship. It's there, but I wouldn't say it was huge. And ideology, again, liberals, less likely in March and less likely in July. So this is what brought us to our echo chamber hypothesis, which I'm saying is probably the most controversial. So what are echo chambers? And I'm sorry, I'm cutting this off. I don't know how to get it back into the center. But echo chambers, as they're defined, are media environments that attract like-minded members, that reinforce their beliefs by repeated exposure to messages that support those beliefs, whether those beliefs are reliable, trustworthy, or not. And conservative media attract users who are predisposed to believe in COVID conspiracies because they're supported by then President Trump, either directly or indirectly, for that reason, are more likely to want to pay attention to those media. And they're also likely to distrust mainstream media because they distrust all forms of mainstream information, including science and what the government will put forward based on scientific-backed knowledge. So they distrust the mainstream media. They do trust the conservative media. And Frank Luntz, who's a very prominent commentator, pointed out, he said, users of Fox News want their news to affirm them rather than inform them. And I think this is what we see today for sure. Those of you who know anything about Tucker Carlson and others on Fox News can certainly identify with this. So the predictions this makes is that persons who tend toward conspiratorial thinking are going to be attracted to conservative media. They're going to reject mainstream sources, so they won't pay attention to mainstream TV or print. And that even conservatives who don't engage in conspiratorial thinking are going to be influenced by conservative media because they're already watching conservative media. And continued exposure to conspiracies on conservative media is going to increase belief in them with consequences for trust in government and adoption of preventive actions. So we looked at this over the whole year, going from March all the way to November. And here's the reasons why this is controversial. Because exposure to mainstream media is really widespread. And even if you're not just exposed to that, you're probably exposed to other sources. As I showed you, there's the aggregators, there's liberal media. So there's a lot of thinking, especially within political science, that this is a bogus concern. Because the mainstream media, everybody's going to get exposed to the mainstream media. You're going to hear the truth eventually. And so if there is an echo chamber, it's very small. It's not a big deal. But let's remember, about 20% of the population, as I showed you earlier, is using conservative media. This is not a small segment. And so, as I'm going to show you, this can have a dramatic impact. So here's what we did. We tested this over the 3 waves of the first year. We used growth curve modeling, which allowed us to look at changes in conspiracy beliefs over time as a function of stable media use starting in March, as well as individual differences such as conspiratorial thinking, conservative ideology, other predictors that we can hold constant. And we were able to look at various outcomes, like do these things have impacts on vaccination intention or wearing a mask? Or most important, I suppose, for the argument I'm making now, is do they trust the CDC, which is this agency that uses both science and the government to try to help us control a pandemic? So this is the growth curve model for one of our outcomes, which is trust, both at the intercept, which is in March, and then over time, from March to November. Trust in the CDC. How much do people trust CDC? And conspiracy beliefs are here at the intercept. And of course, if you have a lot of belief in the conspiracies, you're not going to have much trust. Very strong negative relationship. And then if you increase in conspiracy beliefs over the course of the year, it's going to lead to a reduction. This is a correlation in a sense, but it sort of makes sense that if you increase in belief in conspiracies, you're going to have a decrease in trust in the CDC. And the media habits that are predictors of these conspiracy belief, intercepts and slopes, are mainstream print is negatively related to the intercept of these beliefs, and conservative media is positively related. So people starting out using conservative media also have more of these beliefs, as I've shown you already. And here's the interesting thing: over time, they have an increase in conspiracy belief slopes, which of course reduces their trust in the CDC. And people who are following mainstream print, to the degree they increase in that, they have a decline in conspiracy beliefs over time. So I think this is the sort of the nut of it. And now I'm going to have real problems because I can't. I apologize for this. I'm not sure how to get this over.
Is it, sorry, maybe possible if at the top you click and try to...
There it is. Thank you, Paulia. Brilliant. Yeah. So here's the important, these are looking at direct standardized predictors of the intercepts and slopes of conspiracy beliefs. So here's conspiratorial thinking, which we measured using that Usinski measure, which is, do you think there are people working behind the scenes to influence the way the government works, in other words? So you see that people with this tendency are already in March having these beliefs. They are also more likely to use conservative media. They're somewhat less likely to use print at the time. They're much less likely to increase their use of print. And they're also not much, but somewhat less likely to watch TV news. So this is sort of a core part of the argument for the echo chamber proposition. And there's you can see people who voted for Trump. We asked people, did you vote for Trump? Because by the time we got to November, the election was over. So Trump voters are already, on board with conspiracies. They're watching conservative media. They don't want to use print news. That's bad news. They don't want to watch TV. That's no good. And again, they overlap considerably with the conspiratorial folks. And so another thing we did to look at this argument about echo chambers is what is the composition of conservative media? And the composition of conservative media, which accounts for 12.3% of our sample, which is a nationally representative sample, so weighted and so forth by demographics. So these 12% who are in this group are almost 60% Trump voters who believe in who have a high conspiracy mentality. And then, of course, you got some folks who are Trump voters who don't have a conspiracy mentality, but they're in the same boat because they're watching conservative media, paying attention to conservative media. So this is our echo chamber here. It's composed very strongly by people who are who have conspiracy mentality. Even those who didn't vote for Trump, who have a high conspiracy mentality, are taking part in this, what we're going to call an echo chamber. And then, the people who don't use it are populated by low conspiracy folks. We can do the same looking at mainstream print. Here you get the reverse. So among the people using mainstream print, which is about 18% of the population, and you still have half the population not using it. But among mainstream print, you've got basically, people who don't believe in, don't have a conspiratorial mindset. And broadcast TV, here's another source of evidence for the echo chamber. The people who don't use broadcast TV were predominantly Trump supporters with a conspiracy mentality, or non-Trump supporters without a conspiracy mentality. But there they are because of Trump's influence, even if they don't have a conspiratorial tendency. I can show you some more different predictors of these other behaviors. I've shown you trust slopes and intercepts. You get the same pattern for vaccination and mask wearing. People with intercepts who have high intercepts in conspiracy are much less likely to vaccinate and wear a mask. Slopes in conspiracy, they're much less likely to want to vaccinate over time, much less likely to want to trust the CDC over time. Again, this is the change in their belief in conspiracies. And mainstream TV, which is unfortunate, is related to all of these behaviors, but not to any change. So people watching mainstream TV, they're not learning anything. They're basically starting out saying, yeah, I'm going to vaccinate, yeah, I'm going to wear a mask, and yeah, I'm going to trust CDC, but it has very little impact in terms, compared to what you see with conservative and all the factors that affect conspiracies, has very little impact. Here we looked at mediation between print and conservative, because these are two extremes. Print media definitely reduces beliefs in conspiracies, and so it leads to a higher level of vaccination at the intercept, and then mask wearing at both time points. And then if you look at print's influence on change in conspiracies, it leads to an increase in vaccination. Mask wearing, we couldn't look at that except at each time point, because we only have 2 time points. And then conservative media, which of course is related to conspiracy beliefs, is related to a lower interest in vaccination and mask wearing at both time points. And conservative media leads to an increase in belief in conspiracies, which leads to a decrease in vaccination. We looked at belief in conspiracies in the election study, and I'm not showing you a lot about that, in part because a lot of that's going to come out in other work that isn't peer reviewed yet. But I think this is sort of instructive, and I know I'm running out of time. People who are very high in conspiracy belief in our election study, right from the word go, had no confidence in the election, in the fairness of the election. Whereas people at the other end, who may have had not such strong confidence, but gained confidence, and are people who are being more exposed to mainstream sources, are gaining in confidence about the election as time goes on. So this is the beginning. This is done in July, and then we end up here in red, which is after the election. And as you all know, after the election, we had the January 6th event. We had all kinds of chaos, which continues today. But the folks at the high end of the conspiracy mentality scale were always much more skeptical about the fairness of the election. And I'm not showing you, but they were also much more supportive of the January 6th event, much more inclined to support the use of violence for political ends. I think this sort of gives you a sense of who these folks are. Let me give you another sense of who they are. Again, this has not been published, but it's part of our election study. These are correlates of people who have a conspiracy mentality based on the four states that we looked at during the election. And so they definitely have a negative emotion towards Biden winning. So we asked them, how would you feel if Biden won? Not so good. How would they feel if Trump won? Very good. One thing that's worth a lot of discussion is the racial resentment aspect of this. There's a whole lot of correlates here that I don't have time to go into. We can talk later. So what can overcome this? You're probably wondering, well, gee, this is a pretty sad story. What can overcome it? Okay. I don't want to be totally pessimistic. There's evidence across countries, again, by Hornsey. He's the guy that's been looking at this across different countries. Countries where people have a sense that their economic position is at risk and is frail are more likely to have conspiratorial mentality. This suggests that maybe there's a way of helping people to feel they have more at stake in an improvement in their economy. And I think this is something that politicians are already trying to do if you look at what Biden's doing. Another strategy is trusted spokesperson. So even though Trump, backed vaccines, he didn't push it very much. And so there's a group of researchers who fed people on social media with Trump backing vaccines. And they found that if they did that over time, and they did this selectively in different US counties, they had higher vaccination rates in counties where they pumped messages from Trump saying, I really do think vaccines are a good idea, you should get one, which he never really said very much, but they showed that you could get a higher rate of vaccination. Dr. Oz, those of you who live in Pennsylvania know about him, Dr. Oz actually has a following among people with conspiracy mentality. And a study done by some of our colleagues in the Policy Center showed that before the pandemic, he actually came out and said, the MMR vaccine isn't so bad after all, you should get it. And in a survey that was ongoing, the researchers from the Policy Center showed that people who initially were not on board with the MMR vaccine actually felt better about it after Dr. Oz endorsed it. And this is probably causing trouble for him because some people are saying, well, he's really a liberal. So let me just briefly say, what we conclude from this. The conservative media have supported the growth of conspiracy beliefs. Mainstream print have worked to reduce them. Mainstream TV has done neither. It's kind of sat there. Despite faith in the reach of mainstream news as a buffer against these things, their influence is limited, especially among conservative media users, because they either don't watch it or they don't believe it. The other implications are a lot of the focus on social media, I think, is overdrawn. It's really this very powerful institutionalized source of conspiratorial media that we see in Fox News and other players now who are inhabiting the conservative media landscape now that Rush Limbaugh has gone away. And so even if the social media platforms were able to get rid of a lot of their content, which they've tried to do and they have been somewhat successful, it doesn't reduce the influence of these echo chambers, which are being broadcast on traditional media, cable, broadcast TV, and radio. And then, obviously, what the argument that these echo chambers, I think, are continuing to be a source of a challenge. So I want to thank, of course, Kathleen, who worked with me on this, and also mobilize a lot of our resources to do this work. Qualtrics helped us a lot with getting Newark on board to help us with our national survey. Some folks at the Policy Center, Ken Wing, Gary Gaiman, and then the election study, which I'm hoping you will all get to see eventually by the end of the year, had a whole bunch of other folks aside from the Policy Center. So that's the story, and I'm look forward to any thoughts or comments you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for the presentation.
Should I stop the screen share here?
Maybe you could leave it in case someone wants to reference the slides. So we have one question in the chat from Jacqueline. Would you like Jacqueline to make the question, or should I?
No, you can go ahead and read, but go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So did you measure effect of conservative media plus social, given that algorithms support creation or maintenance of echo chambers?
So I didn't get the whole, so Can you say it again? How does conservative media support echo chambers?
Did you measure effect of conservative media plus social, given that algorithms support creation or maintenance of echo chambers?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I'm not catching the.
Sorry, just to be clear, it was, did you measure those that were like sort of exposed to both conservative and social, given social media, given the known algorithms in social media to precisely feed those conspiracies and probably create or contribute to an echo chamber? So it's that relationship. Over?
Yes, well that, so if you just look at social media alone, it's primarily social media with users who have a conspiratorial mindset where it gets to feed into the echo chamber. So to blanket social media with the cause of vaccine hesitance or unwillingness to do things to control the pandemic is a little bit of an overgeneralization, whereas conservative media is a much first of all has a bigger reach in many ways, and a more powerful influence than even social media. So when you put them both in the model at the same time, and especially in that last study where we looked at it over the three waves, social media didn't even factor in anymore, because once you control for whether or not someone's got a conspiratorial mentality, social media doesn't even enter anymore. It's primarily the other the more widespread sources of conservative opinion and news. I'm not downplaying social media. I'm not saying it's not a factor, but it's a segment, that probably feeds off of what's going on in the more global, the use of more traditional media like cable TV. I know, does that answer the question?
I think so, right? Jacqueline wrote in the chat. Yeah. Great. We have two more questions, 5 minutes. There is Raven, but there was a mix up with our link, so I suspect that's not really Raven, because Raven works at our center and there's several Ravens in the audience. Whoever has the hand up apart from Kevin. Okay. So maybe right. If you want to write your question in the chat, then please. And then Kevin.
Okay, so let me see if I can see the chat here. Oh, so did I answer the question from Melissa?
You did, yes.
Okay, okay.
Okay, I'm trying to unmute the Raven with the hand up. It's not working. If you want, on the meantime, Kevin, to go ahead.
So I kind of looked at some of the trust issues with COVID cross internationally, and looked at how, not in a study or anything, but looking at what public health people were saying, say we're in Denmark or whatever. And one thing that was really striking about our coverage is that our public health officials, I think, were actually less trustworthy than because they didn't admit mistakes readily, and their communication strategies were, they would sort of change messaging, and they seemed uncomfortable with their messaging at various points. And so I'm wondering if there's anything you've done or seen or read that tries to disaggregate whether people are changing their trust levels in response to confusion or mixed messages, like about our masks, do they work or not, and whether that leads to lower trust if people perceive lower trustworthiness, not merely because they're being told a conspiracy theory, but just genuinely because they think, well, they said A and now they're saying B and now they're saying C.
Yeah. I think you're raising a good point, which is that people who have a conspiratorial mentality can find lots of evidence, if they look for it, that the people in charge aren't always telling us the things that we should hear. Like, it's pretty clear that CDC knew that mask wearing was important. Why would they tell medical professionals to wear masks and not tell the public to wear a mask? That made no sense. And it was purely for the sake of protecting the ability of the medical people to get masks. And so what they should have said right off the bat was, we don't have enough masks. Yeah. That would have been a much better, transparent, open communication. They didn't do that. And so that plays, I think I agree with that, it plays right into the hands of people with a conspiratorial mentality. Look, they're not telling us the truth. And the same goes with African Americans. They have reasons to distrust the medical community from past experience. And so they will, to the extent they have a conspiratorial mentality, they can find reasons for it. I don't know if these problems existed in other countries to the same extent. We haven't done a content analysis, maybe you have, of how the WHO put forth recommendations. Did they say that you shouldn't wear a mask in the beginning? I'm not sure. I don't know. It's a good question.
In the Danish case, apparently there's a lot of cross-talk, like between public health officials and the public. They're actually communicating with each other and adjusting. And that's something I think we just didn't really have, but I think the give and take helps.
Yeah. Well, I think another lesson from this, which I didn't put up, is that we need more transparent communication. If CDC were just a lot more honest and would tell us things that are done for non-medical reasons, and they just have to be done for pragmatic reasons, as opposed to medical reasons, then people would believe them more,
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so the other question in the chat was,
what's the cause of the mindset? Yeah, This is one of the great questions for the future. I put up a whole bunch of correlates that are leads, things like poor economic standing, a feeling left behind, and having politicians who are willing to play on those kinds of insecurities. We don't know much about the genetics, and I'm not a big believer in genetic determination. SES would certainly be a factor. People with lower SES is one of the correlates. So there is work going on in researchers who've been studying cohorts of young people over time. And there are international surveys of young people when they're in high school and the kinds of beliefs they have about democracy. And there's some evidence that there's already, starting in high school, there are kids who don't trust mainstream media and have a certain amount of distrust of the government. And so this could be a very early kind of, it could manifest early. But again, I don't think we know. And I think it's a pretty important topic for research to figure out not only what can we do to help people with this mindset, but also what can we do to avert its development to the level where it becomes an obstacle to collective action, like dealing with a pandemic.
Perfect. Great. So yeah, thank you so much. This is all the time we have today. So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us, and Jerry for joining us. And thank you so much, everyone. We will have our next talk in 2 weeks. We will send you a reminder of that talk, the same link, same time, everything. Yeah, thank you so much again, and have a nice rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you want to stay, Dan.
Oh yeah, thanks everybody. I really, and of course, get in touch if you have any thoughts or suggestions or criticisms. More than welcome to hear them.